All right, we'll go ahead and get started for today. Thank you again for joining. Today's presentation is going to be on media protection. Good news here is there are quite a few controls, I think 8 or 9 controls, but they're very short. There's a lot of kind of overlap, if you will. So the amount of content that we're going to cover today is shorter than some of the others. So probably won't keep everybody the full 30 minutes, but we'll cover the important things that you need to know and understand. Everyone knows me. Going to skip ahead here. No new updates or changes to CMMC that we need to pass. And as usual, all the family-specific resources are listed here. Going to call out NIST crypto here because in one of the later slides, you'll see that I'm going to reference the crypto document. But this is one where I think if you want to go and get more information on this family specifically, because it's a little bit vague in some of the things that they're saying, you're going to find yourself probably asking yourself, well, how do I really do this? What do they expect of me? This document is going to be important because it talks about the cryptographic mechanisms that are involved. It can get a little detailed when you get into that at that level. But the point here being, you're just going to see that there's some vagueness. And one of the fears that I have in watching some of the webinars that have been put on by the DoD Deputy CIO, as well as the CMMC AB, is that the takeaway was of the 300 or so companies they initially assessed, companies were scoring themselves much higher than what the DoD and CMMC thought they were at, which either means that folks are, falsifying information, or they're reading the controls. They think they meet the intent of the control, and that differs from what the DoD thinks. And I think this family of controls is one of those areas where that could easily happen. So as we go through this, just keep that in mind, that as they release more information and they finalize things, you may need to revisit this family. So 9 controls, as I said at the beginning here, we'll get right into these. Physically controlling and protecting and securing system media containing CUI, both paper and digital. At a high level, this seems pretty simple. I mean, I either have, paper or digital CUI, but I wanted to put some notes in here. Don't forget about anything that they could consider a medium or something that could hold CUI. Some of this came directly from the NIST publication. Some of it is just through common knowledge, but things like papers, external media, which could be classified as removable hard drives, thumb drives, USB drives, compact discs, magnetic tapes. A lot of people using the tapes for backup. Probably don't see too many diskettes anymore. A lot of network storage, SAN storage, NAS, things like that. A lot of cloud storage, AWS, Azure, etc. Probably not going to see microfilm, but they put it in there. I didn't want to delete it or remove it, but I would be hard pressed to see how many people are using microfilm. But I think the point here, though, is there's probably things that at first glance you're not thinking of. And as you go through to try to secure this data, you have to understand, what mediums even exist. So one of the questions I put on here is the second bullet. If you haven't labeled or segregated the data, how can you be sure you've protected the correct data? This ties to, if you don't even know the types of media that could contain CUI, how could you label that media? How could you segregate it? How do you protect it? So it's almost like a cascading effect here, that at the very beginning, you must understand the types of media that are involved, and then follow all the processes that we'll talk about through these 9 slides. You may have to consider vendors and software that are involved in protecting CUI and making sure their systems are adequately secured or protected. You may be paying a third-party vendor for an application that does some business function for you, but then inadvertently, you may need to store a piece of data that would be considered CUI. How is that vendor managing security for that application? Do you have a proper inventory management system? So if you're not inventorying things, how do you know what exists, who has it, where it's at, what it contains, etc.? This one I think is often overlooked because we inventory assets like laptops, servers, peripherals, monitors, things like that, where you can put an asset tag or a label, barcode, something you can scan. But do you actually do that on things like disks? Do you do that on a SAN or something that's out in a data center? You may or may not do those things. Even something like a thumb drive. Who's likely going to wrap a barcode onto a thumb drive? Probably not going to happen. But how many do you have? Where are they? Are they secured? And then where are you actually securing them when not in use or when in use? Are they in locked drawers, desks, cabinets, safes? Do you have a room that these things are in? So a lot to be considered here. But I think, again, the biggest point to hit home is you've got to start with understanding what media exists and what you're using before you can achieve any of these, kind of follow-on steps. The next big one's going to be limiting access to the CUI to authorized users. So there's different things that you can do. Clearly, you could give limited read-only access as well as editor-write access. So if we're talking about files out in a cloud environment, maybe you need contractors and subs to access the data, but you only want them to read it. There are solutions for that. Maybe you have to be able to work on a presentation, a PDF, a contract, whatever, where edit and write access is needed. You'll have to make that determination. You're going to need a good way to protect from data exfiltration, and I say where applicable. So if you're going to be storing things in a SharePoint type environment or a third-party SaaS environment, how do you stop things from being downloaded to a workstation, emailed out, etc.? How do you determine how to validate a user as an authorized user? This may seem kind of like, well, this doesn't make sense, or this, why would I have to focus on this? But think about organizations where you have dual functions. Maybe you're supporting DoD contracts with a portion of your staff, but then the rest of your organization works in a commercial setting. If I had a 100-user or 100 employee company and 10 are supporting DoD, 90 aren't, then I'm not going to give 100 people access to the CUI. From an onboarding perspective, it's obviously easier for IT just to set everyone up and grant them access to everything, but you are now violating things like need to know, least privilege, etc. So you're going to have to come up with a way of determining who should be an authorized user and then validating that they're authorized users. And then you're going to have an ongoing process for auditing that access. So it's not going to be good enough for the auditor just to say, well, here's my process for how I onboard and determine who gets the access. How do you know over time somebody didn't inadvertently get added that shouldn't? Someone's changed roles and you forgot to remove permissions. Someone just accidentally punched in the wrong name, maybe same first name, wrong last name, etc. You're going to have a process for auditing that. While they don't call out the specific timelines and frequencies of those audits, you will have to determine that. And then we're all, to some extent, going to have to hope that what we choose, the auditors is okay with. So if you're doing something like I'm auditing access every 2 weeks or once a month, I feel confident that that would be sufficient in most cases. If you're saying I audit access annually, I could easily see an auditor coming back and saying that's far too long in between audits. Again, there's no written in stone what they'll accept and won't accept at this point, but we have to use a little bit of common sense here to say a lot could happen in a year. How can I call that sufficient? And then you're also, or at least should have, a system or method for checking out and checking in CUI. And again, where applicable, because you may not check things in and out, but we're going to talk about what that means to check things in and out, what it means to transport on a later slide. And all of a sudden, this bullet may have more relevance in your organization. Sanitizing and destroying CUI. This is going to be very similar to how you would sanitize or destroy other media, with the exception that because it has CUI on it, the potential for reuse and disposal is a little bit different. If I don't have CUI, I wipe a hard drive and I reuse it. If I do have CUI, I may have to take additional steps. To do it, obviously, you have to know the types of media you possess. I've said that 3 or 4 times already, but you have to also know where it resides if you're going to properly destroy it. If you don't know where it's at, then one, you can't say that you ever properly destroyed or disposed of it. And when we start to talk more and more about cloud data, consider the fact that your data is out in a cloud provider's environment. It's probably replicated to multiple locations for redundancy purposes. They're not telling you or showing you where that is. You don't have access to the actual hardware. So if you go to delete something, you may delete it in the working instance that you have. That does not mean it's deleted from other zones, backups, etc. One of the methods that we often employ is called crypto shredding. And what that means is essentially I'm going to encrypt something and then I'm going to re-encrypt it and I'm going to get rid of the keys. And therefore, even if the provider, the cloud provider, does not actually delete the data from all locations, it's been encrypted twice and the keys are gone. So it should be unencryptable. And for our terms, that would be an equivalency of a deletion, destruction, or disposal. Again, these are things, though, that you will have to set up, because if you're working in a cloud space, they're not going to automatically do something like that for you. You need the process, the procedure, providing the evidence to your auditor, et cetera. One of the things that comes up frequently in all of our conversations is the don't forget to include type comments. We will quickly, when I say we, I think just most of us from a common sense perspective, will immediately jump to things like servers, workstations, thumb drives, removable media. But are we talking about printers, scanners, copiers? These devices where, something's stored in memory, it's stored somewhere for spooling, for example, maybe it's going to be reused later, temporary files, the printed copies that come out, things like that. I think that's just often overlooked. It's probably minor in comparison to all of the electronic storage that you would have. But nonetheless, the last thing you want to do is have an exposure because of something like a printer or scanner. And then consider methods for sanitizing documents that will still be in use once CUI is removed. Because CUI hasn't necessarily become mainstream yet, it's not in necessarily the current contracts that you might be working with. I kind of look at this the same way as I would classified information, in that they have a way to redact and sanitize a portion of a document, but then still use that document. So, how are you able to make use of documents where CUI may be sanitized, but you still have a use for that for some other reason? The government will likely have to put out their rules and expectations on that, but something that you might just want to consider. And then these last kind of 4 or 5 slides are going to be much quicker because, as I said at the beginning, there are fewer bullets, and then they become a little bit more vague here. Marking media with the necessary CUI markings and distribution limitations. One of the problems here is that I get asked a lot of questions like, how should I mark it? How will I know? What should I do? There is DoD training that was created for DoD employees on how to properly mark media. It primarily talks about documents and email. It explains things like, if an email is sent, here are the types of components in the email that must exist, whether it's banners, signatures, etc. If it's a document, here are labels and markings on like cover pages and throughout the document. One of the big things that is kind of mentioned today that I think we all can follow for now is that the government is responsible for marking and classifying these documents and these communications, etc. Now, obviously, they're going to follow, as you will as well, federal law, executive orders, directives, policies, and regulations. But the way they've kind of communicated it right now, the contracting officers or a delegate would be responsible for marking it. So if you're receiving communications from the government and they are not marked as having CUI, then I believe the expectation should be it is not CUI. I do think down the road, there's going to be an expansion of that, where as you work back and forth with your government counterpart, you will have the ability to create content that would be considered CUI, as it may pertain to presentations, response requests that the government makes of you and your contracts. So it's going to be very important to find out, what are they considering CUI? Do they have an expectation for you to mark it? Do you need to go through training to make sure you're marking it appropriately? Because again, at the end of the day, I always tend to side with, if you say it must have this marking or it's not CUI, I receive something that doesn't have that marking, then I can confidently say I'm not holding CUI. But we all should know, if we worked with the government, that an oversight on their part doesn't, relieve us of any responsibility. They could easily come back and go, well, you still should have known. We told you, the definition of CUI. They could always mark something and then try to retroactively, make it effective. So just be careful with this one. I think this one, a lot of folks that I talk to don't really want to go have these conversations with their contracting officers. They don't want to be seen as kind of a problem. They think that if they go and question the COs, that could potentially impact their ability to win future business. I can't tell you from a business perspective how much risk you should take in those conversations, but I can say that if it were me, I would want to know that I wasn't violating federal law at the risk of upsetting a CO. Now, if the COs don't know the rules, they're not well versed, that's obviously going to be a little bit more of a challenge for you than maybe some of the ones that are being a little more proactive. But at the end of the day, you're trying to approach this, or should be trying to approach this, from increasing our security posture as a nation. Asking these questions are important. Controlling access to media containing CUI and the accountability for transport outside of controlled areas. So see this a lot in the classified space, and I think it's just good practice to carry over, and I think it's the intent of the NIST 800-171. When you're using a third party to transport and destroy media, consider the security of the transportation itself. A lot of companies will come and pick up your content, whether it's papers that are in burn bags. Iron Mountain, for example, will come pick up, locked garbage cans that they'll go and then shred or burn. They may come pick up hard drives that they're going to destroy or wipe and destroy. Some of the services for a higher cost will now come and do it on site. That obviously alleviates a lot of the risk, because they'll sit in your parking lot and all you have to do is walk the hard drives out to the parking lot to like a mobile unit, and they'll destroy them on site. But if they're not going to do that and they're going to transport it, how are they transporting it? One of the examples that was given years ago was, what if they have it in their van and then their van gets into an accident and, the van rips open and all the media, whether it's paper or hard drive, spills out onto the road. If it were in some form of locked, hardened box, then maybe the box goes out onto the road, but the contents of the box are still secured. Again, these may be, scenarios that are unlikely to happen, but I think you should consider them and plan for them. And if you can opt for just having it destroyed on site, you kind of remove all of that risk. There's also a way of transporting outside of controlled area. So let's say that you have a large building or facility, warehouse, maybe you're a manufacturing organization. You may need to go from one portion of the facility to another. That is technically leaving a controlled area, even though it's still within the confines of your facility. You would need to consider special handling procedures. Same thing, just again, like classified material and a courier. And I think something that wasn't mentioned in this, but I put in there additional to this as well, would be considering and ensuring chain of custody procedures of handing CUI off to a courier or third party. Should an example like theft, an accident or something like that happen, chain of custody is going to become really important from a legal perspective if an investigation were to occur. Implementing cryptographic mechanisms to protect the confidentiality of CUI stored on media during transport. This should be pretty much right in line with what you're already doing. If devices are already encrypted and password protected, et cetera, that should exist even when they're being transported. This is where I said at the beginning that refer to NIST crypto for more information, because they are going to give options and expectations. And I think you're going to have to go define what you have, make a list of what you have, and then what could be transported. And then once you whittle that down, you may start with 10 things, you may whittle it down to 2 things, and then use NIST crypto as a way to say, for these 2 things specifically, how would I transport it? And then you're going to want to write that into policies and procedures. Controlling the use of removable media on system components. So it's good to point out here that this is in contrast to 3.8.1, whereas 3.8.1 talked about restricting user access to the media. This is talking about restricting types of media on systems, such as prohibiting the use of flash drives or external hard drives on systems. So you would obviously want to employ technical and non-technical controls for the use of media. Non-technical controls in this case would be talking about things like policies and procedures, whereas technical would be endpoint protection software that could block the use of, say, a thumb drive. Software has gotten very sophisticated. Software that we use, for example, at Ntiva, the Sentinel-1 product, can detect an external drive being plugged into, say, a USB port, but then can also tell the difference between a monitor versus a thumb drive. So it won't restrict the use of things such as port replicators to make work easier, but it can detect those types of USB devices where it's a removable storage or media, and it can shut that down or block that. So you will need to define and limit the types and numbers of approved devices. Don't forget that just because you approve a type of device, let's say that you do approve a thumb drive, that does not mean that everyone should automatically have free reign to obtain and use them. You will need to think about whether or not you will allow them to use their own, or if it's a corporate furnished device. Obviously, if you use a corporate furnished device, you can set expectations because you make the procurement. You can get secure devices that are a little more expensive, but more secure, something that a user might be less likely to do. And then you may want to also, as in a previous slide talked about, check in and check out those devices. Is there a reason why every employee would need that throughout the year? If they need to courier something, maybe you allow them to put something onto a thumb drive, courier it, and then they have to check it back in when it's back, and then you get to control the way that the media is destroyed. So again, just limit kind of like the need to know type aspect of this. And then consider technical controls to prevent writing or deleting data from devices. There'd be a lot of instances where someone may need to read something, but why do you want to give them the ability to copy that data off, delete it, etc.? So just limit risk anywhere that you can. Prohibit the use of portable storage devices when such devices have no identifiable owner. This one's kind of a no-brainer. If no one can, if no one owns it, if no one's labeled it as whose it is, what it is, who, what's on it, just prohibit it. This is very similar to, a malware issue where someone has a CD sitting on a desk and someone throws it in their computer to see what's on it. If someone just has a thumb drive lying around, someone's likely to plug it in. That could have CUI on it. You could have spillage. And finally, protect the confidentiality of backup CUI at storage location. Again, use the cryptographic mechanisms to protect backups of CUI. And this one's another one where it's going to depend on whether you do the backups yourself, you have an MSP like Ntiva doing it for you, you pay a cloud provider to do it. So really investigate what you're doing, what type of solution you use, and what's the best way to back that up. And then again, using cryptographic mechanisms like crypto shredding as ways of making sure that that data is never retrievable in the event that it wasn't destroyed or deleted as requested. And that's it. If there are any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Like I said, we are getting done a few minutes early today because some of these slides just honestly didn't need or require a lot of content. All right, if there are no questions, appreciate you guys joining as always, and we will see you next month.